What if the story you thought you understood was only the surface? What if the real shock was buried beneath it? On the world's biggest podcast, Mel Gibson sat across from Joe Rogan, and he pulled back the curtain. Not just on a movie, but on faith under fire. This wasn't Hollywood gossip. This was resistance, accusations, suffering that left Rogan himself visibly shaken. Tonight, we uncover what everyone missed. Before The Passion of the Christ shattered box office records, before it rewrote the rules for independent cinema, it was radioactive. Studios wouldn't finance it. Distributors wouldn't touch it. Agents warned against it. In boardrooms across Hollywood, the verdict came swift, unanimous. No audience would sit through a subtitled film in Aramaic and Latin. No one wanted 2 hours of unflinching brutality, not with an R rating. Not about the last 12 hours of Jesus Christ. Mel Gibson did not adjust the vision. He did not soften the violence. He did not translate the dialogue into English. The concept remained stark, immovable. Crucifixion as it was, not as Sunday school paintings preferred it. Executives called it commercial suicide. Some called it worse. When Gibson spoke with Joe Rogan years later, he described the resistance as more than financial hesitation. It was ideological. In an industry that prides itself on boundary breaking, a sincere portrayal of Christ's suffering was treated as provocation. Rogan himself noted the irony. Hollywood celebrates openness, yet Christianity often lands in a category of acceptable dismissal. Then the storm intensified. Before the film even premiered, accusations of anti-Semitism ignited headlines. Critics argued that portraying certain Jewish authorities in the gospel narrative could inflame hatred. Prominent voices within Jewish organizations publicly opposed the project. The Anti-Defamation League raised concerns. National debates followed. The controversy threatened to eclipse the film itself. The discourse became louder than the footage. If you're ready to see how deep this really goes, stay with us. Gibson's response did not waver. From the beginning, he insisted the story was not about collective blame. It was about universal responsibility. The crucifixion, in his view, was not the crime of one people. The hand that drove the first nail wasn't a prop. It was Gibson's. Not a stunt double, not an anonymous extra. His own hand. That close-up wasn't cinematic flair. It was confession. Gibson was making a point without a press conference. The crucifixion wasn't about blaming one people, one century, one courtroom. It was about all of us. The hammer falls. The weight is shared. That gesture reframed everything. The suffering on screen wasn't an indictment. It was a mirror. And when no studio would stand behind that vision, Gibson did something Hollywood rarely sees at that scale. He funded it himself. $30 million. Personal money, no safety net. If the film failed, it wouldn't be absorbed by shareholders or buried in accounting language. It would be his loss, financially, professionally, permanently. He built the production from the ground up. Southern Italy became first-century Judea. Ancient stone streets, harsh landscapes, cold winds cutting across open terrain. He hired dialogue coaches to train the cast in Aramaic and Latin. Dead languages, no modern shortcuts, no English compromise, subtitles only. For studio executives, it sounded like commercial suicide. Then he cast Jim Caviezel as Jesus. Respected, yes. Famous, no. No marquee safety, no box office guarantee. Just conviction. And the violence, unfiltered, unsoftened. The scourging wasn't implied. The crucifixion wasn't symbolic. It was prolonged, graphic, physically exhausting to watch. This wasn't stained glass storytelling. It was flesh and blood. The rating board stamped it R, as expected. Distribution came through New Market Films, a small independent company, not a major studio, because the majors had already decided. The executives who had passed on the project sat in their offices watching a film they'd called unmarketable become a cultural phenomenon. Gibson had risked everything publicly: his fortune, his reputation, his place in Hollywood, and he'd won just as publicly. But that victory, as massive as it was, told only half the story. Because what happened during filming would cut deeper than any box office number could measure. The cliffs of Matera, southern Italy, Rome's Cinecittà Studios. Winter didn't just arrive, it attacked. Wind tore across the exposed rock at nearly 30 knots. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and the cast wore little more than first-century fabric. No modern coats between takes, no heated trailers waiting nearby, just stone, wind, and cold. At the center of it all stood Jim Caviezel. He wasn't just playing a role, he was carrying a weight most actors would never understand. He was 33 years old when he accepted it. His initials were J.C. When Gibson first explained the project to him, stretched over hours of conversation, Caviezel mentioned the coincidence. Gibson went quiet, unsettled. The next day he called back. His tone had changed completely. "This could end your career," Gibson told him. "You may never work in this town again." It wasn't a warning meant to scare him off. It was the truth. Caviezel had already turned down the role of Jesus twice before in other projects. But this was different. Gibson wasn't offering a gentle portrait. He was offering brutality, authenticity. No soft focus, no safe distance. Caviezel said yes. He knew the cost. And the cost arrived quickly. On those frozen cliffs, with cameras rolling and wind screaming across ancient stone, the violence they were about to film wasn't symbolic. It was designed to be as close to real as a human body could endure. During the whipping scene, something went wrong. The Roman soldier swung. The protective board behind Caviezel missed. The whip hit flesh. Not once, twice. A 14-inch wound opened across his back. What you see on camera isn't acting. That's real pain carved into skin. Later, carrying the cross through the Via Dolorosa sequence, the 150-pound structure slipped. It crashed down, directly onto his head. His face slammed into stone. He bit clean through his tongue. The blood you see in that scene? His own. His shoulder dislocated under the weight. It stayed injured for the rest of production. But the crucifixion scenes, that's where his body began to break. Suspended nearly naked on a cross. Freezing wind cutting across 1,000-foot elevation in southern Italy. Hypothermia set in first, then pneumonia, then a lung infection that wouldn't leave. Between takes, medics worked to keep him stable enough to continue. The prosthetic makeup sealed one eye shut. It destroyed his depth perception. Every step became a hazard. Migraines pounded through 12-hour shooting days. By the end, he'd lost significant weight. Movement hurt. Simple actions required effort he didn't have. And then came the final day, the Sermon on the Mount scene. Fifth take. Storm clouds gathered over Matera. Lightning struck. Caviezel was hit directly. Producer Steve McAvity described seeing the bolt connect. Assistant director Jan Michelini stood nearby, holding an umbrella. The lightning forked. Hit him, too. It was Michelini's second strike during production. Caviezel later said he saw fire on both sides of his head. The crew made a sound he'd never heard before. Not a scream, not a gasp, something deeper. The strike triggered heart complications. 2 surgeries followed. One of them, open heart. But what happened after the cameras stopped rolling? In 2023, Caviezel revealed something that froze the room. During one medical procedure, he died on the operating table, had to be revived. When asked what part of filming affected him most, he hesitated. There were things, he said, he could not even talk about. For Gibson, these events were never random footnotes. On Joe Rogan's podcast, he spoke about the impact the film had on Caviezel, how the experience reshaped his faith in ways neither of them anticipated. Several cast and crew members reported profound spiritual shifts during production. Conversions, renewals, personal reckonings. Was it coincidence? The psychological effect of intense subject matter, or something else unfolding beneath the visible narrative? Gibson doesn't frame the world in purely material terms. For him, there are spiritual dimensions that overlap with the physical. He doesn't apologize for that belief. His faith has never been casual. A traditional Catholic devoted to the Latin Mass, steeped in theology. Gibson distinguishes between the spiritual foundation of the Church and the human institution that administers it. On Rogan's platform, he didn't restrict his criticism to Hollywood. He turned it inward. The scandals that have shaken the Catholic Church over the past decades. The cover-ups, the silence, the betrayal of trust. Gibson has addressed them bluntly in interviews, often to the discomfort of church officials. One case stands as emblematic. Theodore McCarrick, former Cardinal and Archbishop of Washington, D.C., laicized in 2019 after decades of allegations involving seminarians and minors. For Gibson, McCarrick's rise through the hierarchy, despite warnings, despite complaints that reached Rome as early as the 1990s, reflected more than administrative oversight. It signaled systemic failure. Yet Gibson doesn't reject the Church. He demands accountability from it. He separates doctrine from corruption, faith from frailty. To him, the lightning strike, the suffering on set, the institutional scandals, and the resistance to the film are not isolated incidents. They exist within a larger conflict he believes is real. A conflict not confined to headlines or box office numbers, but to the unseen. If Theodore McCarrick could ascend to the highest ranks of influence despite years of complaints and internal warnings, what did that say about the system designed to guard moral authority? His removal didn't originate from quiet reform within ecclesiastical walls. It came after investigative journalism and sustained public pressure forced. Gibson draws a line most people miss. The Church as a spiritual body, rooted in 2,000 years of doctrine and sacrament. That's one thing. The Church as an administrative structure, run by fallible men who sometimes fail catastrophically. That's another. One he reveres, one he scrutinizes. He doesn't abandon the institution, he confronts it. On Joe Rogan's podcast, that distinction surfaced again and again. Gibson spoke not as an angry ex-Catholic lobbing grenades from a distance. He spoke as a believer, someone who insists that demanding accountability isn't rebellion, it's fidelity. Demanding integrity, in his framework, is an act of love towards something sacred, and that resonates. Because millions of Catholics have watched scandal after scandal erode trust in leadership, while their personal faith remained intact. They feel the tension between doctrine and administration, between belief and bureaucracy. Gibson articulates that tension without softening it. But then the conversation widened, because for Gibson, the failures inside the Church aren't isolated events. They sit inside a much larger framework, a worldview structured around conflict, good and evil, light and darkness, redemption and corruption. He doesn't describe these forces as poetic metaphors. He treats them as realities operating across institutions, industries, and individuals. In that framework, the resistance he encountered while making The Passion wasn't purely commercial hesitation. It was part of the same terrain: the backlash, the controversy, the personal cost, all connected within a larger struggle over truth and meaning. You don't have to share his metaphysical assumptions to recognize the coherence of his perspective. And on the podcast, Rogan didn't rush to dismantle it. He listened. He probed. He let Gibson articulate his convictions without interruption. But the conversation had been circling something deeper all along: Hollywood, the church, corruption, integrity. All of it, in Gibson's telling, leads to a single historical claim: a tomb in Jerusalem. An event that either anchors Christianity in reality or dissolves it entirely. You could feel the shift in tone when the discussion turned there, because if the resurrection didn't happen, that was the axis of the entire conversation. Not the film, not the controversy, but what happened 3 days after the execution. When Rogan finally steered toward the resurrection, Gibson didn't hesitate. He started with the foundation. The Gospels, he said, are not myth, not poetry layered over legend. He regards them as history, real people, real places, real events. Critics dismissed Jesus as fiction, Gibson acknowledged. But he pointed to references outside the biblical texts, ancient historians, Roman records, evidence affirming his existence. Then he shifted to something far more controversial: the Shroud of Turin. That centuries-old burial cloth has been studied, debated, carbon-dated, and dismissed. In 1988, 3 independent labs tested it: Oxford, Arizona, Zurich. All 3 dated it to the medieval period, somewhere between 1260 and 1390. Case closed, most assumed. But Gibson told Rogan the story didn't end there. More recent examinations, he said, have challenged those conclusions. New testing suggests contamination from a 1532 fire, repairs made with newer thread, results that might push the date back to the 1st century. Rogan leaned in. Because the mystery of that image has never been solved. It's not painted, not dyed, not produced by any known artistic method. The imprint appears superficial, almost like it was formed by a sudden release of energy, something no lab has been able to replicate. Few relics sit at that intersection: faith and forensic science, belief and measurable data. Gibson let the weight of it settle, but then he moved to what he considers the strongest evidence: the apostles. 12 men remained after the crucifixion. Their leader had been publicly executed by the most powerful empire on earth. Association with him was dangerous. The logical move? Retreat. Denial. Self-preservation. Instead, according to early Christian tradition, they endured persecution, imprisonment, execution. James, son of Zebedee, killed by Herod Agrippa around 44 AD. Peter, crucified upside down in Rome under Nero. Gibson framed it simply: every one of them chose death over renouncing what they claimed to have seen. And here's the weight of that argument. People may die for something they believe is true, but they don't willingly die for something they know is false. That was the fulcrum. Something, Gibson argued, transformed those men from terrified followers into willing martyrs. Something they couldn't unsee. Gibson made a case that startled even Rogan. These men didn't just believe what they preached, they died for it. Not comfortable martyrdom centuries later, immediate, brutal, within years of the crucifixion. What makes a man choose death over silence? James, brother of John, beheaded by Herod Agrippa. Peter, according to early church testimony, crucified upside down in Rome. Men who had everything to lose and nothing material to gain. Gibson pressed the point. Who rises 3 days after public execution? Who does it by their own power? The question hung in the air, and Rogan didn't interrupt. In an environment where public figures measure every syllable, where controversy gets redirected into safer territory, Rogan let the statement stand. That silence mattered, because 2 days earlier, he'd interviewed Christian apologist Wesley Huff, described the historical case for Jesus as fascinating. Then came Gibson, back to back, on the largest podcast platform in the world. Christianity wasn't being mocked. It wasn't being reduced to a cultural footnote. It was being examined seriously. But here's what most people missed. Gibson didn't scale his language down. He didn't speak in metaphor. He described spiritual realms as concrete realities. Good and evil, light and darkness, forces contending over human souls, not symbolism, framework. For him, that framework explains everything. The hostility during the Passion, the suffering on set, the corruption inside religious institutions. All of it, part of a broader spiritual conflict. The clip circulated rapidly, not because it was scandalous, because it was unguarded. A public figure with nothing left to prove, speaking in absolute terms about belief. No hedging, no brand management, just conviction. And the response online? It wasn't ridicule. Comment sections filled with stories, personal doubts, renewed faith, questions long unspoken. The moment resonated because it touched something many carry quietly. Then Gibson revealed what may be his most ambitious project yet: the resurrection of the Christ. He told Rogan the script took 7 years to write. Not a simple narrative, something far more complex. A story that would stretch across dimensions, across time itself, into realms most filmmakers won't touch. But before anyone could process the scope of what he was describing, the screenplay took 7 years to write. Gibson worked with his brother and Randall Wallace, the man who wrote Braveheart. When he finally read it, he called it the most ambitious thing he'd ever seen. So ambitious, he wasn't sure he could pull it off. The first film was simple: 12 hours, arrest, trial, crucifixion, linear, chronological, brutal. The sequel is something else entirely. To show the resurrection, Gibson argues, you can't start at the tomb. You have to go back. Further than Gethsemane, further than Bethlehem. You have to begin with the fall of the angels, the fracture between heaven and earth, the primordial rebellion that set everything in motion. The story stretches across realms, through Sheol, the realm of the dead, through spiritual dimensions invisible to human eyes. From the moment Lucifer fell to the death of the last apostle, non-linear, multi-dimensional, moving through past and future, colliding at a single point. In a 2022 interview, Gibson admitted the material borders on science fiction, but to him, it's something deeper: theological cosmology rendered cinematic. Jim Caviezel is returning. He's 56 now, 20 years older than when he carried that cross. Digital de-aging will bridge the gap, because the story unfolds only 3 days after the crucifixion. Filming is expected in Italy. Gibson has mentioned 2026 as a possibility, but no studio has signed on yet. No confirmed budget. Caviezel has publicly stated he believes this film could become the biggest in cinematic history. Not just in the religious genre, across all genres. The visual scope alone is staggering. The fall of angels, the descent into the realm of the dead, the harrowing of hell. and the resurrection itself, not as a quiet awakening, but as a rupture in reality. Because here's the question Gibson has wrestled with for over a decade. How do you portray resurrection without shrinking it? Not with soft light, not with gentle music, not with a quiet garden at dawn. If it happened, it redefines everything. Death is no longer final. The material world is not the whole story. And if it didn't happen, then why did 12 men give their lives for it? The historical record is uneven. We know James, son of Zebedee, was killed by Herod Agrippa around 44 AD. We know Peter was likely crucified upside down in Rome under Nero. But the others? Tradition says they scattered across the known world and died for what they claimed to have seen. What did they see that outweighed survival itself? The script is complete. The vision is set. But the question remains. This whole journey, it's more than just a film story. The physical price Gibson and Caviezel paid? That went beyond anything normal filmmaking demands. Struck by lightning, hypothermia, dislocated shoulder, 14-inch whip wounds. But the deeper cost, the one that can't be measured in scars? That's where the real story lives. This was a testament to unshakable conviction. A man betting everything he had against an industry that wanted him to fail. $30 million of his own money, his reputation, his career, his family's security, all for something he believed was true. And here's what that forces you to confront. What are you willing to sacrifice for what you believe? Not just say you believe, not just think about on Sunday morning, actually risk everything for. Because that's the question Gibson lived. That's the question Caviezel lived. That's the question those 12 men lived 2,000 years ago. They didn't die for a story they made up. They died because they saw something, and they couldn't unsee it. Now here's what most people still don't know. Gibson isn't finished. After 7 years of writing, he's preparing to release The Resurrection of the Christ. The sequel nobody thought could be made. Not a continuation, a completion. 3 days between death and resurrection. The harrowing of hell. The cosmic battle unseen by human eyes. Told across dimensions and time itself. Caviezel returns. At 56 years old, ready to pay the price again. This isn't just cinema. This is legacy. The kind of legacy you leave when you refuse to compromise. When you tell the truth even when the world doesn't want to hear it. The kind your children remember. The kind that calls them home. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because the deepest truths, they're still being uncovered. This is Jesus of The Voice.